All right, we're at 12 o'clock. We'd like to get this meeting started. So welcome to everyone. We will be recording the formal part of this session. So we'll begin recording now. Welcome. This is our September 30th Bayou Culture Gathering. If you are just joining us now, we encourage you to please introduce yourself in the chat, list your affiliations and any other important information that you would like to share with us. Today, we're really excited to have Patty Ferguson Bohnee with us. She will be the presenter for today. We'll be able to introduce her formally a little bit later in the presentation after we get some information to you. So these are our partners. You saw this before in the other slide: Louisiana Folklore Society, the Center for Bayou Studies, Folklife in Louisiana, Center for Louisiana Studies, and the Wetlands Discovery Center. We also need to thank our funders, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, and Louisiana Office of Cultural Development. You also see Mike Saunders' email down there. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact him about the things that we present to you all today. Again, if you're just joining us now, please list your name and affiliations in the chat to introduce yourselves to everyone. One of the other things that we like to do for the Bayou Culture Gathering is we like to offer a spotlight for the Passing It On workshops. That's a part of the Louisiana Folklife program. If any of you are interested in doing one of these Passing It On workshops, please contact Maida Owens. You see her contact information there. If you don't get her contact information now, please just let us know at the end of the meeting and we can share that with you then. This is one of the examples of one of those Passing It On workshops. We realize that it might not be such a great idea to post pictures of delicious food right now at a 12 o'clock Zoom meeting, but this is a Filipino food waste workshop. It was done by the Philippine American Women's Association of Louisiana. So this is the type of event that would fit with those Passing It On workshops. This is a roadmap for today. We have our speaker, Ms. Patty Ferguson Bohnee. After she presents to us, we're gonna open the floor to any questions that you may have of her and continue with the discussion. Once we're finished with that part of our presentation, we always like to ask the presenter to let us know what their hope for the coast is. We also open this up to all of you. If you would like to type into the chat what your hope for the coast is, or if you'd like to share it with us, we appreciate that. Then next, we're gonna hand it over to Ms. Maida Owens to share with us information about the position statement that we've been working on for the past couple of meetings. We'll share announcements with you about what to look forward to next. And then that's when we, after that, we end the formal part of the program, and then we just hang around and share ideas and strategies in moving forward concerning a lot of the issues that we're working on here. So with no further ado, I'm honored to be able to introduce to you today's speaker, Ms. Patty Ferguson Bohnee. She's a faculty director of the Indian Legal Program and director of the Indian Legal Clinic at Arizona State University. And her presentation today is Indigenous Sovereignty and Knowledge in the Face of Environmental Crises. Ms. Patty, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for asking me to participate. I'm Patty Ferguson Bohnee. I'm a member of the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe. I also represent Pointe-au-Chien on federal recognition and land loss issues, environmental issues, and I appreciate having the opportunity to participate. I've been participating in some of the work groups, and I think that this gathering is fantastic. And so I want to commend everyone for bringing folks together and for lifting up voices. I think that's really important. I was asked to talk about some of the work that I'm doing with regards to sovereignty and self-determination and how that's happening in the face of different man-made and Environmental Crises. And I'm providing a picture right now of Pointe-au-Chien. This is in the 1940s. And I just show this to illustrate that Pointe-au-Chien was very lush and fertile. The Mississippi River topsoil, we replenished Pointe-au-Chien every year. It created new lands. The barrier islands protected the area, and we were a self-sustaining community. Everything that you needed was provided from the land: materials for your homes, medicine, fresh water, food. We had large agricultural farms, fish, game, domesticated animals. And you can see by looking at this photo that the houses were on the ground. And this is in Pointe-au-Chien in the 1940s, and we can see we're not even 100 years later, and you can no longer live in this way. But I always like to reflect that my mom was born in 1947, and when she was born, her family lived in a palmetto house, and it was on the ground, a dirt floor, and the times have changed so much. And I think it's just very important to note this, that people were living in self-sustaining communities along the bayous. So I'm showing you this because I'm looking at issues impacting our tribal communities and thinking about how did we get here. My tribe and other coastal communities were once self-sustaining, but coastal Louisiana tribes have been severely impacted by the government's decision to reroute the Mississippi River and to create the Mississippi River levee system. There's been destruction of the wetlands caused by oil and gas exploration and drilling, and that's contributed to the land erosion and subsidence. And now we've been severely impacted by slow onset events such as sea level rise and climate change. And saltwater intrusion has killed a lot of the plants. We no longer have fresh water, and so that impacts our subsistence lifestyle, and we're more at risk for future events. So I just want to point that out, and I've written a paper, and I can share that with anyone, that basically these are value judgments that were made by people who are in power about what's important to protect, who's important to protect, and the tribal people and other people impacted by these in these bayou communities were not consulted on these decisions, and they weren't part of the decision making. And this is just to show you the land loss. I'm sure that y'all are familiar with it, but it shows the region in 1932 and also in 2010. So over the past few decades, the landscape has changed dramatically. The barrier islands have disappeared. The saltwater intrusion has impacting farming, cattle, also ability to grow your own food. And this is one of the fastest eroding areas in the United States. And this is just a more stark view of this. And I just want to note that we have had numerous villages that have been relocated that were in these red areas where people could no longer live. I mean, people often don't think about the relocation that's happened before, but we've had people relocating since the changes that started to begin in the 1930s and 40s. We had people who lived way further down the bayou. And we know that the CPRA estimates a larger sea level rise from 2.85 feet to 4.85 feet in the Terrebonne Basin in the next 50 years. And this is just to illustrate the Cutoff Canal, which is in where the current village site for Pointe-au-Chien basically ends, but people live further down the bayou. The top picture is from 1907, and the bottom picture is from 2017. So it really just demonstrates the changes in real time. And so what are the barriers? How did we get here? And I just like to point out that the main barrier for the tribal communities and exercising self-determination, protect land, and cultural heritage for our community in particular is the lack of federal recognition. And so one of the things I look at is, can we create a legal framework that addresses cultural heritage, environmental harms, and disaster resilience that's not limited to federal recognition or recognized governments in order to support the self-determination of coastal Louisiana tribes. And I just want to provide this by way of background, because some people may not know this, but in Louisiana, the tribes in Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish were not allowed to go to school until a much later time. There were policies in place that were English only, which impacts our language, cultural heritage, but also integration of the schools. And in our community in Pointe-au-Chien, people didn't actually start going to high school until the late 1960s. So this has a real impact on the ability of people to protect their rights, to advocate for their rights. It leads to individuals and companies taking advantage of tribal people because they can't speak English, they can't read and write, they can't read and write French. So I think it's important to point that out. So there are a couple things that I want to show how the lack of federal recognition impacts the ability to address climate impacts and environmental disasters. So the first one is a lawsuit that our tribal community filed in 1993. Originally, LL&E was, they cut up these trannasses and kind of make barriers in different areas in the land, and they were cutting through a burial mound. So people from our community went out with guns and they said, "You're not going to do this. We're going to shoot you. You better leave." And LL&E filed a suit basically to say they're trespassing. They should be prevented from doing this. And so we had the case removed to a federal court because we said basically this is our Aboriginal land and we have a right to be here, and actually you should not be here. They were claiming the land under the Swamplands Act. And one interesting thing about the Swamplands Act is like the whole point of it is to drain the land and make it usable for beneficial use. So to create levees, to drain the land, which they didn't do. But the other thing, and what we argued, is that Aboriginal title was not extinguished through the Swamplands Act. There has to be a direct extinguishment of those rights. And the federal court said, well, let's wait until the federal government decides whether or not you're federally recognized before we determine the outcome of this case. So this case has been sitting in the Eastern District of Louisiana since 1993, and we've been going through the federal acknowledgement process since the mid-1990s. So that's just one example. The other example is the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010. At that time, none of our community was protected by a levee, so we're really concerned that there was going to be a hurricane, that the oil was going to come into our community. We could potentially be a Superfund site. When we noticed oil in our area, we contacted the Coast Guard. We got a staging area in place, and that was very important because we're moving faster than the state and parish in our areas. But one of the negative things that happened was there was remains and archaeological items that were found, and some of the federal tribes who were from outside of the state of Louisiana were objecting to our tribal members participating as tribal monitors and from us participating in the Section 106 process. We did work with the state to become to have consultation status. We had to request that, but to have to request that and be denied, I think, is truly problematic, specifically when they were finding remains and admitted that they knew that those were our ancestors. Because we weren't federally recognized, we're also dealing with the responding agency, in this case, the Division of Wildlife and Fisheries, and they told us they couldn't consult with us because we weren't a federally recognized tribe. And I said, well, I don't care what you call it, but if you're coming into our community, you have to talk to us. So of course, that is a huge issue for us. And you can see all of the issues that were impacted by the BP oil spill. The other thing that I want to note, because I think it's interesting, is that we have a big mission to protect our sacred sites and the areas that are going to be exposed, because we're not part of any levee system. And you can see at the bottom right, this picture is these trannasses that oil and gas companies cut up. And on the top left that is the same Trenasse on the other side of the bayou. So you can see how wide these open up. And so we proposed projects to create oyster shell, basically stabilization projects with partners at CRCL, and we actually worked with NOAA at Terrebonne Parish. We worked with them to obtain a grant, and we had all of these partners. But because it was a federal grant, it went through the Section 106 process, and a federal tribe in another state objected because no federal tribes had said anything. So they just basically objected until a federal tribe said something. And so we had to write a letter to the chairperson of the tribe to say, please release your objection, because I don't think that you want to be responsible for a sacred site not being protected, that's being eroded because of these oil and gas canals that are bringing in water at a faster rate. So, it's just things that you shouldn't have to do to assert your self-determination and sovereignty that happens. And then the last thing that I'll just like to note is that Hurricane Ida happened last year. I know that y'all are all very familiar with that. The second landing of the eye went directly through Pointe-au-Chien. And the really unfortunate part is that FEMA said that they couldn't work directly with us, that we had to work with the state. And then the state would tell us you have to work with the parish. And under the emergency operation plan, both the state and the parish should be working with us. But it was very difficult. The director of Indian Affairs at the time told, as have been told nonprofits and FEMA that actually we were not state recognized. And so all of these issues like impacted response and delivering life-saving aid. And so that's really unfortunate. The parish Terrebonne Parish at least has confirmed now that they received our requests, but they didn't respond to us because they did not know that we were a separate tribe. Even though Terrebonne Parish recognizes us, we are recognized by the state of Louisiana, but there's been this increased effort to undermine the self-determination of the smaller bayou tribes and their legitimacy by causing confusion within the state and the parish. And so this really has a direct impact on the ability to respond in a crisis. So I'm just going to leave that there, but I will note that there was a task force on state recognition meeting last week where actually questions were raised as to whether these smaller tribes are political entities and that we're not fully state recognized, but there's no tiers in state recognition. And if people have questions about that, I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. I want to note, well, what are you doing? How are you raising awareness? How are you addressing some of these other issues? So first of all, I just want to say that this is a human rights issue in addition to, issues under state law and federal law. It's really a human rights issue. There's a basic principle in international human rights law that peoples are entitled to determine their own political status. And so important is this collective right to self-determination that it's included in numerous human rights documents that the United States has signed on to, in addition to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a declaration, but there's also positive law. And there's certain articles in the Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People that I think is important here, which includes the right to self-determination, the right not to be forcibly removed, the right to practice your cultural traditions and customs, and the right to maintain and develop your political, economic, and social systems. And there's also within this the right to free and prior informed consent, meaning that you should be consulted before actions are taken. So our tribe, along with 3 other Louisiana tribes and a tribe in Alaska, filed a complaint with the United Nations in January 2020, and I can provide you the links to that, basically saying that the state of Louisiana, the state of Alaska, and the United States government have failed to protect human rights of our tribes because of human-made decisions and natural disasters. And we had recommendations to the federal government of what the federal government should do and what the state should do. But these are the rights that I have listed here that we're saying were violated. The right to life, right to self-determination, right to cultural heritage, the right to subsistence and food security, and then the rights to safe drinking water, physical and mental health, and adequate standard of living. So what happens is when you file a complaint, it will be investigated by the special rapporteurs, and there were 9 special rapporteurs that this was sent to, and they give the U.S. government 2 months to respond. Under the last administration, they did not respond to any human rights complaints that were filed, but if they don't respond, after that 2 months, the response of what they've sent to the government is released. And so these 9 special rapporteurs filed a response in September 2020, and they expressed grave concerns about the issues and rights that were contained in the complaint and the impacts of oil and gas exploration in Louisiana, about whether there was free and prior informed consent, and about whether our self-determination has been violated through all of the issues that were raised in the complaint. So the complaint's about 50 pages with an appendix, and then they have a response with also an appendix of various rights. And so I can provide that to people also. And so the next step would be to invite the special rapporteurs to come and visit our communities so that then they can make findings. And since there were none invited during the last administration, there's a huge backlog of requests that are being made. But the goal is to get some of them to come out and visit our communities and to make findings. And people would say, well, why does that matter? This is international law. The state and federal government doesn't really care about these things. But this gives the US government an opportunity to respond, and it also elevates the issues so that people are talking about the issues, because if no one's talking about your issues, then they're not going to address the issues. And then I don't know where I am on time. I'm sorry, because I'm not paying attention, but I just want to mention some of the things that we're continuing to work on. We have multiple balls in the air, but obviously before Ida, one of the things that we were focused on was elevating homes to adapt to the changing environment. But with Ida, most of the homes in our community were impacted. We only had 12 homes that were livable after Ida. And so we've really been focused on resilient rebuild, meaning that people are living in homes that can withstand increased storms. When you elevate homes, they seem to catch more wind, but they also weren't resilient. So we haven't had the funding invested into our community so that people who actually, when they were born, lived in a palmetto house, there hasn't been resources to allow them to adapt to the changing environment. And in our community, a lot of the people live in areas where they might not have title to the land, but we consider it family property. And so that impacts the ability to apply for some of the resources that are going to be available to people to rebuild more resiliently, and impacted their ability to get certain funding in the past to rebuild. And so we're really trying to work on this and get investments from partners and nonprofits, or make pleas like, can you invest in us as a pilot community? Because people plan to stay there. Only one family has chosen to leave since Ida. But obviously, if they aren't living in a more resilient home, it's going to be devastating for future storms. We've also built established community gardens outside of our community, and we're working on a raised medicinal garden because of all the saltwater intrusion where a lot of our medicinal plants are. We have a bulkhead project where people can tie off their boats to protect them. We're working on backfilling oil canals, and we're working on our second oyster stabilization project with CRCL. We actually had the first weekend of this project last weekend, and this weekend we'll have another opportunity, which is going on today, right now, and then also tomorrow. We're also working with Sea Grant on a tribal coastal resiliency index that we hope will be helpful to all tribal communities, and working with our traditional ecological knowledge on different resiliency measures. Some of the people who participated in the coastal group yesterday heard from Matt Bethel of how Sea Grant is working with us to use our TEK with Western science to try to support projects that are resilient in our areas. And with that, I am going to pause and allow for any questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Patty. We really do appreciate the work that you're doing. If anyone has a question, if you would, you can use the icon and raise your hand, and then that will put you up to the front of the line like Gary just did. Gary, if you you have the floor for your question.
Thanks for that talk. That was really interesting. Appreciate you being here. You know, since I've been watching these many of the things happen that you talked about, what I always wonder about is, do you have an example of where the government has done this the right way that we could mimic here in Louisiana, where there is better communication between tribes and the government so that it works out?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. Do you mean the right way with regards to restoration, or just in general working with the federal government?
Well, maybe that's my first idea, is like the government working with tribal elders in the way that the tribe would like to see it concerning land, like the conservation of land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think there are some co-management agreements in place between some tribes and national parks, for example, where they have sacred sites or subsistence areas. I know in Alaska, they have some of that joint management, or where they bring in tribal individuals and elders. And I think actually in the national parks, they have traditional landscapes that they recognize. So I think that could potentially be a model. Yeah, I think right now there's a more awareness of traditional ecological knowledge. I think that, you know, when we're discussing climate impacts at the beginning of the discussions with climate, there was a hesitancy to include anything about cultural heritage in general. And now there's been more of a push to include that. A lot of the time we're not looking at how people and communities are necessarily impacted with regards to, oh, you can just move them. Oh, but how does that impact their cultural heritage and the tie to the land? So yeah, that's a really good question, Gary. I know that there have to be examples, so I'm really I'll try to think of some and get back to you, but I am familiar with the subsistence, like a focus on subsistence in the state of Alaska.
Well, thanks for doing your part for kind of like leading the charge here in Louisiana, because we need someone like you. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Gary.
Next question, Timmy Topa, and please forgive me if I mutilated your name, and please share the correct pronunciation of your name so I can get it right for the next time.
You are absolutely very close to being correct. It's Demi Tope. So you're correct.
Thank you for
thank you, Miss Patty, for your presentation. It's very I'll say it's bittersweet. It's very inspiring to see all the work you've been doing. It's also very sad to see what's happening to the native tribes. I just have a question as far as you know, the resilient building you were talking about, particularly as regards buildings and, you know, their resilience. You talked about CPRA giving out data on projections for possible increment in climate change and sea level. And I just want to know if when you are considering resilience building for these structures, especially because some of these community members do not want to leave these communities. Are you planning for resilience with that data projection in view, sea level is going to rise to this to this level, and these communities want to stay. When we are building, making this new, raising and elevating these buildings and making the structure stronger, are you thinking about what might happen and you know, making that consideration in your planning? I'm just, when I see this happen to communities, I wish they can all just move, because I'm currently working on, you know, sea level rise and estimation and land use changes. So I kind of have an idea of what's going to happen. And unfortunately, there's also culture and that will be lost, and so many more values that we don't want to lose. But I'm also particularly very happy when I see people that are working on helping this community stay. But how do we put these projections, these realities that are going to happen, how do we put that into planning for the sustainability of their stay, so that, you know, when they stay, we are sure that they are going to be protected when this increment happens? Are you putting that into consideration?
Yeah, so thank you for your question. So I think the thing that we're starting out with is, yes, we need resilient rebuild of homes, but we are looking at the whole landscape, not just where people are living. And we know that where people are living, if nothing is done below what we call the cutoff, that that will be the, you know, open up to the Gulf. And so that would be detrimental because there would be then no buffer. And we believe there can be ways to improve the buffer and to work on those buffer areas. And as I mentioned yesterday, Matt Bethel presented, and one of the things that we had been working on is like, how can we look at areas that currently exist that are resilient, like areas below the cutoff, that we could propose for projects moving forward to shore them up, to make them more resilient. Because there's miles between us and the Gulf, but if nothing is done, it could be all opened up, and you can see how fast that's deteriorated. And there should be some accountability with regards to those who have been responsible for causing that damage, and there hasn't been any accountability or even you know, actions taken to address that. But definitely for us, we have a connection to the land, I think, as you indicated, including not only, you know, where people get their food as subsistence fishermen are trap, or but also our sacred sites, which include a number of burial mounds and former village sites, some of which we intend to continue to protect. I don't think that our community will give up on that. And I think those measures, those mapping factors, take into account sea level rise. So I think what we've been told in the past, like during the BP oil spill now, is that, oh, we can't do anything in your area because the science doesn't support it. So it's, how do we merge now? How do we like work with science to say, yes, the science does support it. But then, you know, money has to be allocated for those projects. If money isn't allocated to those projects, then you won't be able to support that. But I think people should be thinking about this. Oh no, if that all opens up and Pointe-au-Chien is the barrier, what happens to Houma? You know, what happens to the areas further north? Because that puts everyone else at more risk. So we should think about this as we're all part of a family, and we should be trying to take care of each other, because if Pointe-au-Chien is at more risk, what happens to Houma? What happens to Berg? What happens to these other areas?
Thank you for that. Nina?
I will lower my hand before I want to ask my question. Thank you, Patty, for this presentation and for educating us on the matter. Similar to previous question, but you mentioned how families, 20 families or so, chose to stay and have not chosen to move away or relocate. Do you or the tribe consider a scenarios, like a multiple scenarios in case of, you know, higher sea level rise? So is there a scenario in place for relocation, a scenario in place for staying, or, you know, a scenario for like bouncing back? So like, do does the tribe have the ability to be presented of that knowledge and to choose for themselves, or they choose because they're tied, connected to the land, and they can't see them elsewhere, they refuse to lose the fight, right? And we do learn that with accelerated climate on the crisis, it will be difficult to bounce back for many communities. We'll have to bounce forward in a resilient manner that respects the rights and protects Indigenous people and their choices. But I'm curious to know if there is a multiple scenario in places that the tribe and people, Indigenous people, receive that information and education on the matter. Thank you.
Yeah, Nina, so that's a really good question. The tribe has been engaging in this choice regarding adaptation or resettlement. And we have seen the island's resettlement process. And our tribe has taken positions on that in support of the island, because we view that as not going the way of what the island's goals were for their self-determination. But we are within the Morganza to the Gulf, and Ile de Jean Charles is not. And so we think that it would be more beneficial to us if we could have a piece of land somewhere else that people could evacuate to when that time comes, when there's a storm that's coming to our area, but that requires resources. So in the interim, we're trying to establish relief centers and ways to work with our partners to be able to respond effectively. And I might have misstated the number of people who live in Lower Pointe-au-Chien. It's more than 20 families. We only had 12 homes that were still habitable, but the other families are still there. Only one family, I think we have 80 homes. I think we only have one family that's chosen to rebuild somewhere else. And that's because of the connection and tie to the land. And so one of the problematic things with FEMA is they're offering, trailers, but some of them aren't in our community. So if someone's a fisherman, they can't really fish if they're not in the community. And the fishing industry is an important part of the cultural heritage of our tribe, but it's also an important part of the cultural heritage of the state of Louisiana. And I think those are the things that we should be thinking about. And that if we don't protect the land below the cutoff, including areas that used to be hard land, but now marshland, we're also impacting the natural resources such as shrimp and crab and fish, and the ability to have those for the future, because that's where they breed and then they go out. And so we need to think about this and the impact, the impacts they'll have on the whole region if that occurs.
We also have a question from Jill in the chat. Have the community and medicinal gardens been started? What's their location? Is it open to the public?
Very good question. So we have done a lot of work on gathering medicinal plants, identifying them, meeting with elders, and our medicinal plant garden was a raised garden that was next to our tribal building. And since Hurricane Ida, it has been used to store relief supplies. So we have not broken ground on using it yet for a medicinal plant garden, because it is occupied with relief supplies at this time. But check back, we're working on it. It's a very important project for the tribe.
I have a question, and if anybody else has any other questions too, please raise your hand so that I'll ask this, and I see Maida has her hand up. This may, I am very naive when it comes to things that are not in my wheelhouse, I guess. There seems to me that there would be a lot of benefits, not only for the tribe, but for the rest of the community if the tribe were federally recognized. But it's been a struggle. It's been something that I've heard repeatedly, that it's been a difficult path. What are the benefits? What are the benefits to not have that? So obviously there's a group of people who say, no, we can't let that happen, because if that happens, then we lose this. In my head, we gain much more as a community if the tribes are federally recognized. Why would the tribes not be federally recognized?
Very good question. I actually have a slide, but I could show you, but let me see if I can show you. So there are 7 criteria for federal recognition, and these are the criteria. And you need basically a historian, an anthropologist, a genealogist, lawyers to put together your materials. And the criteria they haven't changed over time. The process began in 1978. But how they interpret the criteria has changed over time to require, okay, the basis is reasonable likelihood. That is the standard of review, but they've been requiring conclusive proof. And so the problem with Louisiana tribes, Gulf Coast tribes, is meeting historic tribe, because there haven't been a lot of use of primary resources from the Spanish colonial period. So there's a gap in the history, and some people who write about Louisiana tribes jump from the French period to sometime in the Louisiana period. And those documents, there's millions of folios. They're in libraries in Spain. They have them at LSU, the Historic New Orleans collection, and they're mostly in French and in Spanish. But they don't necessarily identify people by name. They might have movements of people. And the tribes in Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley were really smaller tribes. They were called Petite Nation. And so that's a big hurdle. Although the tribes are working on that now to present that information. And you have to provide all of this information to the federal government. You have to show your political authority since 1900. In 2015, the regulations changed so that you no longer have to prove it from first contact, which initially was before the US was established, which is a little bit ridiculous. But these are the criteria. And you have to be identified as an Indian entity since 1900, have political authority since 1900, a distinct community. You have to show membership, each tribal member to a historic tribal member. So you have to have a genealogist proving that linkage all the way back to a historic tribal member, and provide your governing document, which is pretty easy, and you couldn't have been terminated, which we don't have that issue with the coastal Louisiana tribes. But I'll just show you this. This is like, we applied in the 90s, and we received a proposed finding in 2008. And then the regulations changed in 2015. So we meet most of the requirements moving forward. We have to provide some information about governments from 1940 to 88, which we now have. And then we're working on our historic tribe information to present. And that includes membership of each person with descent back. So it's a lot of work. And if you have people who have limited educational opportunities, you have to rely on people outside of your communities. And it costs a lot of money to pay experts to do this work for you. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to my last slide.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that explanation. Maida?
Patty, this is another topic that has come up occasionally, but I've never heard a real serious conversation about it, is whether or not living on houseboats should be considered, because it was done extensively in the past. And I mentioned this idea at a meeting in Homa, and basically got eye rolls and saying, we worked really hard to get off of those houseboats. Why would we want to go back on? And to me, well, you can move your whole house out of harm's way. Do you know whether or not this is something that communities on, really close to the Gulf would even consider? Have you ever heard a conversation about that?
I think this is a really interesting question, because we've done about 66 oral histories in our community, and there are people who are living in camp boats. They're called them camp boats or houseboats. And I would read that and it never really struck with me, like, were they living? I thought that they were living. I didn't really know what it was, but actually a few months ago, I had discussions with tribal members because the 1950 census came out and they had some people who were living in houseboats, camp boats on Bayou Pointe-au-Chien. And they were like, oh yeah, people would live in these camp boats and then they would go to somewhere else to go fishing and trapping and then they would come back. And it just hadn't triggered in my mind that people, like, I don't know that it was a fixed, we're thinking about things as a fixed location. But then actually some people moved their camp boats onto land and were living on their camp boats on the land. So this was all a new thing to me. I think it's an interesting idea. I don't know how well the Bayou could handle camp boats. Like if everybody moved to a camp boat and then we're moving, like where would they move their boat to in a storm? They'd have to, the locks might, the floodgates might close. You're trying to move around because people try to deal with that now just with their shrimp boats when a storm is coming. But I think it's an interesting idea, and it would be reflecting back on the way people lived not that long ago, that we did have people who were living in camp boats and they would move around. But yeah, I think it's a good question, and it could be a way to support resiliency and adaptation. And I will bring it up at a meeting just to see what people say.
We have time for 2 more questions. Honor?
And real quick, if I can interrupt, sorry, Honora. I know some of you joined us late. There will always be a recording if you missed some of this early conversation with Patty that we're talking about now. And if you joined us late, please also introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you, Honora.
Hi, yes, I'm one of those that was late, sorry. I guess I had 2 questions, or the original one I was going to ask was, Patty, you were talking about doing the genealogical work to link present tribal members to original or historic tribal members. Are you doing any forensic genealogy using DNA? Because I know that there are people that do that for a number of purposes, where if you may not have the written records, the DNA doesn't lie, so that's forensic DNA analysis is one. And just a quick mention too, when Maida brought up about the houseboats, I recently saw a presentation by a woman, an engineer, who has developed floating houses where they still stay attached in place. They're on the land, but they're designed to float and rise up with the floodwaters. So just 2 questions there for you.
Okay, so with regards to your first question, the BIA has told us that they will not accept forensic genealogy, so that really won't help us for that aspect of the petition. And with regards to the floating houses, I know there's a term for them. We met with an individual and she came to our community, and that does seem interesting. And we met with her, but there wasn't any next step towards that. Yeah, I think that's an interesting, and I know they have those in some communities in different parts of the world.
Yeah, it's Elizabeth English, I believe.
Yes, Elizabeth English, yes.
Yeah, she's an engineering professor and she lives in Canada half the year and in Brobridge the other half of the year. But so yeah, she was very interested in looking at opportunities to do it.
Yeah, she's come to Pointe-au-Chien because I think she's been to State of the Coast as well, if I'm thinking of the right person.
All right, so our last question for this session, and please, if you have questions, stick around after the formal part of the meeting is over, and we can certainly address those. Greer.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation and your work. My question is very easy. You recently were successful in having 2 Native American tribes recognized by the state, and I did not get the names. One is your tribe, Pointe-au-Chien, and the other one is?
There were 4 tribes that were recognized by the
Okay.
state. I think in 2004, 2005, it was Pointe-au-Chien, the Jean-Charles Choctaw Nation, the Bayou Biloxi Chitimacha, and the Grand Caillou Dulac Biloxi Chitimacha.
Okay, Bayou Lafourche. I'm gonna email you, so yeah, it's going a little fast, but anyway, Bayou Chitimacha. All right. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
So one of the things that we like to do is we like to ask our presenters, what is your hope for the coast? What is your hope for the future of our peoples here, of our cultures? And then we'll open that up to our participants in the chat.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a large question, and in my mind, I mean, my hope is that we will invest in more resiliency for our coastal communities. I think that it can be done. We see that it's being done in some areas, but we do that also in some of our marginalized communities and our indigenous communities, and that we support you know, the intergenerational knowledge that will be passed on with protecting that coast for future generations. Because I think, you know, our communities are the oldest communities in the state of Louisiana. And if we lose these communities, we're actually losing part of the history, or a large part of the history of the state of Louisiana.
We appreciate that. Thank you so very much for being with us today, Patty, answering our questions and sharing all the information that you have, and for your work. Tremendous, tremendous work. Thank you for that.
Thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Next, we would like to hand the conversation over to Maida Owens, who's going to talk to us a bit about the BCC position statement.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to say that the position statement is ready to vote on. We're going to have a meeting. Everyone is going to receive a message with the link, but I'll also put it in the chat to see the final version. And especially if you haven't been involved in this process, you're invited to a Zoom meeting on October 20th at noon to discuss it. And then we'll have a 10-day period for people to vote yes or no to accept or reject it. So I'm really excited. I'm so pleased with the number of people that cared enough to really participate in vetting this. We had 3 complete drafts and over 30 people participated, not passively, but actively participated in crafting this statement. And it's basically how to urging the state to address the human dimension in coastal and environmental issues. So if you have questions, I hope you join us or email me, either way. But it is a to accept to or reject vote. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Maida. And also Maida has put a link to the document in the chat. So please feel free to take a look at that. So we have our working groups. There are meetings coming up October 11th, the French language immersion and preservation group, and also cultural and coastal planning Thursday, October 13th. If you're interested in those, please let us know and we will give you the contact information you need to join those.
And Jonathan,
yes,
real fast, since I work directly with the working groups, those are, and the conveners can correct me if they're wrong, those are their tentative days. And you can always go to louisianafolklore.org and you can find the direct information about joining a working group or the contact info for the conveners. And so David Cheremy may let me know if that was a tentative date for their group, but just go to louisianafolklore.org and you can join the working groups or figure out how to participate or just come and listen. Thanks, Jonathan.
No, thank you. And so we're also excited to let you guys know on October 28th will be our next gathering at 12 o'clock. We will have Elaine Claymont with us and her team to present story circles and climate anxiety, listening and sharing stories to renew self and community. You can get more information about that using the link below at that website, louisianafolklore.org. That's also the same web address that Mike just mentioned to get information about the working groups. So that's it for us in terms of our announcements. If there is anyone in the group that would like to make an announcement, you are free to do so now, or you can put that into the chat. There are these ways to connect with us. Again, there's that louisianafolklore.org address that you can find out information or ways to contact us. And again, Mike Saunders' email address is down there at the bottom. We really appreciate you guys being around with us today. And so that's going to wrap up our formal part of the program, but we will stick around here till 1:30. If you guys have to get back to your obligations, thank you again for being here with us. Thank you, Patty, for a wonderful presentation, very informative one. And we look forward to seeing you all again at our next gathering, which is October 28th at 12 o'clock. You should be receiving an email that will have the registration invitation. If not, again, you can find us at the web address. So thank you again. And we hope that you'll stick around for this next part, our informal discussion. Thank you.